This is Jeremy Lawson, Strength and Conditioning Coach at Marin Catholic High School, and today we're going to be talking about what the core is and how to effectively train the core. Now, we're going over this because it really seems like in the strength and conditioning field, it's hard to come across a topic that doesn't somehow involve core training or core function. And really for decades now, the bodybuilding world and the fitness industry has really influenced athletes on how to train the core with more isolated types of exercises. But we've seemed to really realize and learn though now that within the core training type of work we can do, the brain doesn't respond well to isolated movement. Our bodies are really designed to move all at one time with our entire muscular system engaged at once. So let's go ahead now and get into what we're discussing. So now we're going to talk about the anatomy of the core. We need to go over this before we can get into any kind of discussion about core training. So we're going to give you a visual here with the skeleton, and the core is primarily made up of the hip joint here, which is a ball and socket joint, the pelvis, and then the lumbar spine. And then of course we have all of the muscular, tendon, ligament, and fascial complexes that surround this area and allow movement. Now, notice that we didn't mention the abdominals there, and that's what seems to really get a lot of attention usually when we talk about core training and function. But today, what we're going over and what's really primarily of the most importance, to understand the core, we need to go over the hip joint and then the lumbar spine. So let's start here with the lumbar spine. It's the bottom 5 vertebrae and discs of the spinal cord. It's also the largest vertebrae and discs of the spinal cord. It doesn't have as much movement as the thoracic spine or the cervical spine. It's really only allowed about 15 degrees range of motion. So what we need here is a lot of stability. Okay, during movement, this area of the body really shouldn't move too much. Instead, what needs to be moving more is this ball and socket joint of the hip. Okay, this joint needs a lot of mobility. It's designed to move. And the hip should really be the driver of force and of power with movement. And that force and power should come through the core and out through the extremities from the hip. But one thing that's a problem in our society is we've lost a lot of mobility through our hip. And we have too much movement through our lumbar spine. And one thing that's a problem with this is we sit too much. We're a sitting society, and also our youth doesn't play enough. They don't move around enough. They're always in front of the TV or in front of the computer. So what happens is we get stiff here, and we have too much movement here, and then suddenly that's going to really affect any type of core function and movement quality that we have. So as we discuss this, we really get the idea and understand that the abdominals and the erector spinae musculature in the low back, they need to be trained as anti-rotators or anti-flexion and extension muscles. So that's what really needs to happen when we're training our core. And first we're just going to go over a couple basic movements that are very fundamental. We have the push-up from a static position of just lying on the ground, and then we have the squat, and that's going to give us a glimpse into what we need to have for core stability. First, let's go over the push-up from the ground. A lot of people might be thinking, well, this is a measurement of upper body strength, but what it really is a test of core stabilization while the upper body is pushing horizontally. How well the core can stabilize the lumbar spine and sync with the upper extremities generating force tells us a lot about the coordination of the core and extremities working together and whether or not the core engages at the correct moment. As we can see, this athlete is able to push their entire body off the ground simultaneously, and we want to pay close attention to the hips and shoulders moving at the same time while the lumbar spine stays motionless. This tells us that the athlete's core musculature is able to handle a high threshold of force while pushing horizontally with the upper body, and that the core is firing first in anticipation of the extremities movement. Now notice an athlete that is lacking the necessary core strength to keep their lumbar spine stable while pushing themselves off the ground. You can see how the lumbar spine extends as the shoulders come off the ground before the hips. If an athlete does not have the strength or coordination to stabilize their core from a lying position, they may have the same problem while on their feet during different movement patterns. A simple way to help improve this movement is to put something under the athlete's waist. Now that the hips are elevated, the level of force production and stability at the core is lower because the range of motion is shorter. This will allow the athlete to feel and develop a higher level of core strength and stabilization. The other fundamental movement that gives us a look at an athlete's core stability is the squat. This movement shows what degree of motion the ankles, the knees, and hips can flex while the lumbar spine is stabilized. This is not a movement that necessarily shows us core strength because it's being done with body weight, but instead it shows us coordination of the core musculature working with the extremities while they flex and extend. Notice the athlete's ability to keep the lumbar spine motionless while the hips go into full flexion. This shows us a high level of coordinated core stability and simultaneous hip mobility. It is very important to observe what level of motor control an athlete has when they have to stabilize their core simultaneously with hip movement. Notice the following athlete's inability to fully flex their hips into a deep squat position and an inability to prevent their lumbar spine from going into flexion. The cause of this is not as just simple as saying their hips are tight. Joints usually tighten up to protect the body from going into a range of motion that may cause injury. More than likely, there is a lack of coordination between the core and hip musculature that does not allow the joints to move in a full range of motion. This does not necessarily mean that the athlete's core is weak. There may actually be a timing issue of muscle recruitment. The smaller stabilizing muscles may not be firing before the larger prime mover muscles, which will cause problems with movement efficiency. A simple way to help improve this movement is to teach the athlete to squat from the ground up, while holding something and letting go before they squat up. Remember, this is how everyone as an infant learns to squat, so it makes sense to relearn the squat this way. The athlete can feel the stabilization needed at the bottom of the squat and relearn the squat pattern. Now here are some of the exercises that we use to train the anti-rotation, extension, and flexion properties of the core. Notice during these exercises how the lumbar spine has limited movement while the extremities are moving. First are different forms of planks on the hands, the elbows, in the lateral position, with the legs moving, or with an ab wheel. And now some exercises from the very important standing position are first the farmer's walk. The athlete is using their core and their extremities to not allow the dumbbell to alter their movement pattern while in the gait cycle. And next is the isometric standing twist. The athlete is in an athletic position and holding a strap being pulled to one side. This trains the athlete to tighten up and feel the strength distribution throughout the entire body at once. And of course, we can't forget the posterior chain. Different forms of hip extensions will strengthen the too often neglected glute and low back musculature. And perhaps the king of them all is the deadlift. Nothing will strengthen the entire core and promote healthy posture quality like the natural movement of lifting weight off the ground. Well, I hope that you've enjoyed this video and that it's giving you some good education about core training and giving you some good ideas about core training. And remember, as strength and conditioning coaches, we owe it to our athletes to learn as much as we can about the strength and conditioning field.